December 7th, 24. Today program is about notebookLM opinion on NongBee blog. Why shouldn't we talk about politics or religion or etc.? But what if we wanted to? Buddhist Principles and Psychology by NongBee GameBoy. Episode 15E. Link for the blog and video clips are listed below. When NongBee first tried to do the entire show in one continuous podcast, a lot of detail are gone, and NongBee could not ask notebookLM to produce the podcast longer than it would. In other words, cannot specify how long the podcast is. So NongBee divides the blog into multiple chapters and did podcast for each chapter. Since notebookLM is not aware of other content outside the sources, there might be some disconnected in terms of the flow of this whole edited program. NongBee wants the listeners to be aware of this. So enjoy or annoy or whatever, haha.
All right, so today we're going to be tackling something I think a lot of people have trouble with how to actually talk about those topics that everyone always says not to talk about.
The taboo topics.
Yeah, politics, religion, all the things that can make Thanksgiving dinner awkward.
Indeed, conversations that tend to spark more heat than light.
Exactly, and we have this really interesting blog post as our guide for this deep dive. It's written by someone named NongBee GameBoy.
A name that certainly sparks curiosity.
Right, NongBee GameBoy. That's their chosen name that they write under. And
wonderful.
Yeah, it's great.
It's memorable.
Yeah, they're tackling a series called Why Shouldn't We Talk About Politics or Religion or ... But what if we wanted to? So today we're specifically looking at episode 15E, Buddhist Principles and Psychology. And you don't have to be a Buddhist scholar to get something out of this. What I found really interesting is, in the intro to this, NongBee GameBoy is talking about how we all kind of know that we should be able to have these conversations, but none of us really know how. No roadmap.
It's fascinating, isn't it? There's no real roadmap.
Yeah, it's just like, I don't know, avoid landmines.
Yeah.
So let's hope for the best.
Yeah, like fumbling in the dark.
Yeah.
A very apt analogy. So to provide some much-needed structure, NongBee GameBoy introduces a framework they call KNOW.
KNW.
Which, as we'll see, can be applied to any kind of challenging conversation, not just those dealing with hot-button issues.
Okay, so let's unpack this KNOW framework.
Yeah.
The first element is KNOWAA. Know what you are going to do. This is where we lay the groundwork.
Precisely.
Right.
It's about recognizing the potential risks and consequences before diving headfirst into a potentially volatile discussion. Imagine you're about to repair your roof. You wouldn't just climb up there without assessing the situation, would you? You'd check for loose shingles, make sure you have the right tools, maybe even consider your fear of heights.
Yeah. It's funny you should say that because NongBee GameBoy uses a similar analogy. They talk about negotiating the purchase of something. Do you know the market value? What are your absolute deal breakers? What's motivating the seller?
Excellent point. KNOWA encourages us to approach these conversations with the same level of preparedness.
So it's less about avoiding difficult topics altogether and more about equipping ourselves to handle them.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now, the second part of the KNOW framework, KNOWAB, is all about knowing yourself.
Ooh, here's where it gets interesting.
This is where NongBee GameBoy emphasizes the importance of self-awareness, understanding our strengths, weaknesses, biases, even those hidden beliefs we might not want to acknowledge. It's about recognizing how all of these factors influence the way we communicate and react in challenging situations.
So KNOWB is kind of like holding up a mirror to ourselves before we try to hold up a mirror to anyone else.
A brilliant way to put it. And NongBee GameBoy promises to delve deeper into KNOWB in the next chapter.
Okay, teaser. But before we get ahead of ourselves, let's move on to KNOWE, know them.
This is where we shift our focus outward to understanding the other person involved in the conversation. What's their personality like? How do they typically communicate? What might their reactions be? This is especially critical when dealing with strangers, where we don't have the benefit of past interactions to guide us.
Right, because with strangers, you don't have that shared history context.
NongBee GameBoy uses the example of negotiating with a vendor. Imagine you're trying to haggle prices. Your strategy would likely differ drastically, depending on whether the vendor is sweet-mouthed and charming, mischievous and playful, genuinely kind-hearted, or let's say a bit of a trickster.
Right, and it's like tailoring your communication style to fit the person you're interacting with. You wouldn't use the same approach with your best friend as you would with your boss.
Exactly.
Right.
Now, for this part of the deep dive, we're going to hone in on KNOWA in the context of conversations about politics. It's my religion, that's those. Topics many consider off limits.
Okay. So what does KNOWA, knowing what you're getting into, actually entail when it comes to these potentially explosive subjects?
Well, NongBee GameBoy highlights a fascinating concept they call the identity-challenging property of these discussions.
Identity challenging? What does that mean?
Think about it. Politics, religion, these topics often represent deeply ingrained beliefs and values. When those beliefs are challenged or questioned, it can feel like a direct attack on a person's identity, leading to discomfort, defensiveness, even outright hostility.
So you're shaking the very foundation of who they are.
Exactly. And NongBee GameBoy uses this wonderfully vivid phrase, shaken like jelly, to describe how someone might feel when their core beliefs are questioned.
Oh, yeah.
Have you ever experienced that feeling?
I think we all have.
In that moment.
When someone says something that just completely throws your worldview off balance.
Yeah.
Precisely. And this ties into a psychological concept. called cognitive dissonance,
Yep.
which essentially means that when we hold two conflicting beliefs, it creates a kind of mental discomfort.
We naturally seek to resolve that discomfort by justifying our existing beliefs, even in the face of contradictory evidence.
Yeah, it's easier to that you were wrong.
NongBee GameBoy uses the example of a seeker's cult who predicted the end of the world. When the world didn't end, instead of abandoning their beliefs, they doubled down, finding ways to rationalize the failed prophecy.
Wow.
It's a fascinating example of how cognitive dissonance can drive our behavior.
So this identity-challenging property, this potential to trigger cognitive dissonance, is a crucial element of KNOWA.
Absolutely. It's about recognizing that discussions on these sensitive topics can be like navigating a minefield of emotions. We need to be aware of the potential for strong reactions and approach the conversation with a certain level of caution and sensitivity.
Yeah, you wouldn't walk into a room full of dynamite and start lighting matches.
Precisely. You proceed carefully, aware of the potential for unintended consequences. And that brings us to the second key aspect of KNOWA when dealing with topics like politics or religion, recognizing that these issues rarely have clear-cut black and white answers. NongBee GameBoy calls these the gray areas.
Okay, so it's not like a math equation where there's a single definitive solution.
Not at all. These are complex issues with multiple perspectives, interpretations, and potential solutions. There's rarely a universally agreed upon right answer.
Which I think is what makes it so frustrating for a lot of people.
Indeed.
Right, it's like we like to have those definitive answers.
We do. But NongBee GameBoy encourages us to embrace the ambiguity, to recognize that there might not be a single winner in these discussions. Instead of trying to force our viewpoint on others, the goal should be to find solutions that are satisfactory to multiple sides, even if it means compromising.
So it's less about winning the argument and more about finding common ground.
Precisely. It's about acknowledging the validity of different perspectives and seeking out solutions that can accommodate a diversity of viewpoints.
Okay, so I'm starting to see how KNOWA is really crucial. It's like laying a solid foundation before we even attempt to build a conversation, especially on these sensitive topics.
Sure.
Last time we talked about his whole KNOBA principle. Remember that?
Oh, yeah. Knowing what you want to achieve before you even start the debate.
Exactly. Which, let's be real, is way easier said than done.
Oh, absolutely. Especially when you're in the thick of it and emotions are running high.
It's so true. And this time around, we're diving into Chapter 2, NowBee.
Specifically part 1 of Know Yourself.
Right, because Game Boy gets pretty deep here.
Oh, yeah, he does.
He's all about how understanding your own personality and, get this, the personality of the person you're arguing with
can completely change the game when things start to get heated.
Totally. And he also kind of throws some shade at human nature in general.
Like, are we even capable of all this self-control stuff he's preaching?
Right. It's brutal, but also hilarious.
I know. I love when he gets all real like that.
Me too. And he does it right off the bat with this fascinating concept of 6 Buddhist personality types.
Or, as he calls them, demeanors.
Demeanors. Okay, so like we're talking like zodiac signs here.
Not exactly, but there are some interesting parallels.
Okay, I'm intrigued. So there are 6 of these demeanors.
6 in total, but Game Boy, to save us all some time and maybe a few headaches, focuses on 2 in particular.
One's most relevant to conflict, I'm guessing.
Exactly. He calls them touchy and blind faith.
Okay, those names are pretty self-explanatory.
Right. And before we get too carried away, it's important to remember that this is a model for understanding tendencies.
Not like we're trying to put people in boxes or anything.
Exactly. Most of us are a blend of these types, not purely one or the other.
Gotcha. So let's paint a picture here. What does a touchy person look and sound like?
Okay, so picture this. Game Boy describes them as having an irritated mind.
Irritated mind. Okay.
Easily angered, and they just love pointing out what's right and what's wrong.
Oh, I know a few people like that.
Right. They're also methodical, strict on rules, dress neatly, and walk quickly and firmly.
Wow. Okay, I can practically see this person stomping into a debate.
Ready to throw down over every single point.
I'm starting to get a little nervous just thinking about it.
But, and this is key, remember, these are just tendencies, not absolutes.
Right, tendency.
Someone might be touchy in certain situations or when you're talking about certain topics, but not all the time.
That makes sense. Okay, so what about blind faith? They sound a bit more, I don't know, agreeable.
Maybe on the surface, yeah.
Okay, so what's the deal with them?
Well, Game Boy describes them as having a grateful, joyful mind.
Grateful and joyful. Okay.
Easy to please, humbly accepting things, and firmly holding on to a person, principles, or beliefs.
I can see how that could be tricky in a debate.
Right. And he also points out that they often see themselves as good, trustworthy, and more noble than others.
So they're coming from a place of deep conviction.
Oh, absolutely.
I can see how that could make it tough to have a nuanced conversation.
Especially if you disagree with them.
For sure. They might not be as, I don't know, outwardly aggressive as the touchy type.
But that unwavering certainty, that can be a whole other challenge.
Okay, so we've got touchy and blind faith. But what about the other 4?
You want the quick rundown?
Yeah, just a sneak peek.
All right, so besides those 2, we've got lustful.
Okay, lustful.
Driven by desire, constantly chasing pleasure.
Makes sense.
Then there's delusional. Having a hard time separating reality from fantasy.
Oh, that sounds tricky.
It can be. Then we have anxious.
I think I have a pretty good idea what that one's about.
Right. Worrywarts, basically. And finally, there's intelligent.
Intelligent. So like the brainiacs of the group.
You could say that. Sharp mind, analytical, loves to learn.
Okay, so it's like a little cheat sheet for understanding human behavior.
Kind of, yeah.
Interesting. So knowing what we know now about these different types, especially touchy and blind faith.
How do we actually talk to these people?
Yeah, especially when we're talking about those gray areas where there's no easy right or wrong.
Well, GameBoy actually says to avoid those types of debates with those specific demeanors.
Really? Just steer clear completely.
He's pretty adamant about it.
Why?
He uses this boxing analogy, says you might get pulled into a fight without even realizing it.
Ooh, I hate when that happens.
Right. You throw a verbal punch, or maybe they land one on your ego, and suddenly you're in the ring.
Ouch. So he's saying it's almost impossible to have a productive conversation about those gray areas.
He pretty much says that unless you've mastered his advice, you're doomed.
Doomed. That's a bit dramatic, don't you think?
Maybe, but he's not wrong. We all get swept up in the heat of the moment sometimes.
True. But come on, I have to believe we could do better than that. Is he being too cynical?
Well, he does say probably you can't do it because it goes against your nature.
Okay, ouch again. It's like we're hardwired to react to defend our beliefs.
And sometimes logic just flies out the window.
It's so true. All right, before we get too deep into this whole self-control thing.
You want to talk about that little side note he throws in?
Yes. The other part in brackets. Like he's just thinking out loud.
Where he talks about his writing style and how he doesn't care if people agree with him.
Exactly. It's like he's saying, hey, I'm just putting my perspective out there. Take it or leave it.
He's not writing to please everyone.
Definitely not sugarcoating anything.
Yeah.
And he brings up karma, right?
Yeah, he says readers are responsible for their own reactions to his words.
If they get offended, that's on them.
Basically. I kind of love how straightforward he is about it.
Me too.
Yeah.
It's a good reminder that we have a choice in how we react to things.
Always. And his big takeaway from that section is to focus on learning and applying useful information.
Instead of getting all bent out of shape over it.
Which ironically is excellent advice for those heated debates we're talking about.
Okay, that's a great transition back to our main topic. So if self-control is the key to winning these arguments, as GameBoy puts it.
How do we actually do that? Cultivate that Jedi-like calm?
Yeah, what does that even look like in practice?
Well, he frames it as a game, asks, what kind of speaker wins a debate?
And as
what's the answer?
The one who projects self-control, stays calm, and even manages to inject some humor.
Humor in the middle of an argument.
Yep, even when provoked. He suggests it's not about being right.
It's about being unflappable.
Exactly. Like a Jedi Master.
Okay, I like where this is going. But seriously, is that even possible? I mean, we're only human.
I think it's a goal worth striving for, even if we don't achieve perfect mastery all the time.
True. And GameBoy does give some practical tips for how to get there, right?
Oh, yeah. We're going to get into the nitty-gritty of self-control in part 2 of this deep dive.
Stay tuned, everyone. Things are about to get really interesting.
Last time we left off on a bit of a cliffhanger.
Right, with GameBoy's pretty bleak take on human nature.
Can we really master this whole self-control thing?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Well, the good news is GameBoy does offer some actual strategies.
Okay, tell me more.
It's not like some magic formula or anything.
No magic wands here, right?
But he breaks it down into some, steps.
Okay, I like steps.
Yeah, and the first one is understanding what self-control actually is.
Not just like gritting your teeth and hoping for the best.
Not exactly. It's more about choosing how you respond to your emotions.
So like hitting that pause button before you say something you'll regret.
Exactly. That pause, that split second of awareness, it's crucial.
It gives you a chance to take a breath and decide how you want to handle it.
And choose a more skillful response.
Skillful, I like that. Like we're leveling up our communication skills.
Exactly. But how do we actually train ourselves to do that?
Yeah, that's the big question, isn't it? Especially when everything in you is screaming to react.
Well, one of the most important things is learning to actually listen.
Okay, full disclosure, I'm not always the best at that.
What do you mean?
Sometimes I'm so busy thinking about what I'm going to say next that I don't really hear what the other person is saying.
I think we've all been there.
It's like I'm just waiting for my turn to talk.
Yeah, but here's the thing. When you truly listen, even when you think they're totally wrong.
Wrong. How can I possibly learn anything from someone who's wrong?
Hear me out. They might have a perspective you haven't considered, or they might say something that helps you see your own position more clearly.
So it's not about agreeing with them, it's about understanding where they're coming from.
Exactly.
Okay, I can see that.
And even if you don't change your mind, that understanding can be valuable.
How so?
It can help you tailor your response in a way that's more likely to connect with them.
Instead of just talking past each other?
You're actually having a dialogue.
Okay, so it's like a puzzle, right?
Yeah.
Knowing yourself, knowing the other person.
And then using that knowledge to choose the best way to respond.
That sounds exhausting.
It can be, but GameBoy also gives some really interesting examples of what this looks like in action.
Like what?
Like staying calm even when the other person is losing their cool?
Oh yeah, he's big on not letting yourself get sucked into that anger vortex.
Right. He says, don't let your voice gradually become louder and louder until it becomes yelling, which means it's over.
I love that line. It's so true.
So vivid, right. And he talks about not interrupting, not resorting to personal attacks.
And avoiding those, what does he call them, unreasoning anecdotes?
Unreasoning anecdotes, yeah. Those little stories that don't really prove anything.
Like, my uncle smoked his whole life and lived to be 100, so cigarettes can't be that bad.
Exactly. And he also emphasizes the importance of body language.
Oh yeah, like not crossing your arms or getting all up in their space.
Right. Staying relaxed, open, avoiding those aggressive postures.
It's like you're trying to be the calm in the storm.
In a way, yes, because when you stay calm, you create space for the other person to calm down too.
You're modeling that behavior for them.
Showing them that it's possible to disagree without it turning into a shouting match.
Okay, that all sounds great in theory. But what about those times when you're really triggered?
When someone says something that just pushes all your buttons and you feel that anger rising up.
Well, even GameBoy admits that those situations are tough.
He even says, probably you can't do it because it goes against your nature.
Not exactly a confidence booster, is it?
So what are we supposed to do? Just give up and avoid all difficult conversations?
He doesn't say that. He basically says it takes practice, discipline, and honesty.
Honesty about what?
About your own tendencies, those things that set you off.
So it's about building that self-awareness muscle, recognizing when you're about to go down that rabbit hole.
And then choosing a different path.
Yeah, but how do we actually do that? Like, what are some concrete steps?
Well, he suggests things like taking a few deep breaths, stepping away from the situation if you can.
Like a timeout.
Exactly, or even just mentally labeling your emotions as they arise.
Like saying to yourself, okay, I'm feeling angry right now.
It might sound weird, but it actually helps.
How so?
It helps you detach from those emotions, see them for what they are.
Interesting. So we're learning to be mindful of our emotions, to listen with genuine curiosity.
And choose skillful responses, even when we're triggered.
Got it. But how do we know if we're actually making progress? Like, are there any signs that we're getting better at this whole self-control thing?
That's a great question, and luckily, GameBoy gives us some pretty insightful ways to track our progress.
Okay, I'm all ears. Tell me everything.
Well, we'll have to save that for part 3 of our deep dive.
Another cliffhanger.
You'll have to stay tuned to find out.
Okay, so we're back, ready to finally uncover the secrets to measuring our self-control mastery.
As promised.
Right, as promised. We've been on quite a journey with NongBee GameBoy.
It has been quite a deep dive.
Exploring those Buddhist personality types.
Trying to wrap our heads around GameBoy's view of human nature.
And, most importantly, figuring out how to actually cultivate self-control.
When things get heated, which, let's be honest, is pretty much inevitable.
Totally. But now, I'm ready for some concrete evidence that all this hard work is actually paying off.
You want to know if you're making progress.
Yeah, exactly. What are some signs that we're actually, leveling up our self-control game?
Well, GameBoy suggests paying attention to both internal and external cues.
Internal and external. Okay, give me the inside scoop first.
All right, so internally, one of the first things you might notice is fewer knee-jerk reactions.
You mean like those moments when you're about to say something you'll totally regret?
But you catch yourself just in time.
Oh, I know exactly what you mean. It's like when someone says something that just pushes all my buttons.
And you're this close to going off on them.
But then, I don't know, something stops you.
That, my friend, is a major victory for self-control.
Ooh. Score 1 for team self-control.
It shows you're becoming more aware of your triggers, and you're actually starting to choose a more skillful response.
Instead of just reacting on autopilot.
Exactly. You're creating a little space between the stimulus and the response.
And that space gives me time to think before I speak.
Precisely. And as you practice this, that gap will naturally widen, giving you more time to consider your options.
Okay, that's encouraging. What other internal shifts might we notice?
Well, GameBoy also talks about a decrease in the intensity of your emotional reactions.
So I won't feel as angry or frustrated or whatever.
Else triggers won't have the same power over you.
It's like I'm finally in control of my emotions.
Well, not necessarily in control, but you're not letting them control you.
Right. So I'll still feel things, but those feelings won't be so overwhelming.
Exactly. You're staying more grounded, more centered.
And that allows me to participate in these tough conversations without getting so worked up.
You can approach them with more clarity and compassion.
Because I'm not so caught up in my own emotional drama.
Exactly. So that's the internal stuff. What about external signs?
Yeah, how do I know if my newfound self-control is actually making a difference in the conversation itself?
Well, GameBoy says to pay attention to how the other person is responding to you.
Like if they suddenly start agreeing with everything I say.
Not necessarily. But if they start mirroring that calmer, more respectful tone,
oh, I see.
That's a pretty good indication that your self-control is having a positive impact.
So if they're less defensive, less likely to interrupt or make it personal.
It means your self-control is creating a ripple effect, influencing the whole dynamic of the interaction.
Wow, that's pretty powerful.
It is, and it just makes the whole conversation more enjoyable, wouldn't you say?
Definitely. Even if we don't agree in the end, at least we can respect each other.
And feel heard.
Exactly. So, as we wrap up our deep dive into NongBee GameBoy's wisdom.
What have we learned?
Well, for starters, self-control is a journey, not a destination.
It takes practice, patience, and a whole lot of self-awareness.
And while GameBoy might be a bit pessimistic about our ability to master it completely,
we can all agree it's a goal worth striving for.
Absolutely. It's about showing up as our best selves, even in those tough conversations.
And who knows, maybe with a little bit of self-control, we can even start to change the world.
One conversation at a time.
One conversation at a time.
It's all about handling insults. And wow, this one really gets deep.
Oh.
NongBee GameBoy brings in some heavy Buddhist wisdom here.
Nice.
Even connects it to like the wild world of Thai politics.
Yeah, I've heard NongBee GameBoy does that sometimes.
One thing that really stood out to me was this idea of dependent origination. NongBee GameBoy uses that to explain how anger and retaliation can kind of snowball.
Interesting.
Like one little insult can set off this whole chain reaction.
Right, like a domino effect.
Exactly.
So how does NongBee GameBoy tie that to Buddhism?
Well, I think that's where you come in. Could you explain that a bit?
Sure. So The principle of dependent origination in Buddhism, it basically helps us understand that nothing exists in isolation. It's all interconnected,
Yeah.
Everything comes from a whole bunch of causes and conditions.
So like a web.
Yeah, exactly. A web of causes and effects. So when someone insults us, it's not just a single event.
Right.
Our reaction to that insult, like the anger we feel, the urge to maybe retaliate, it all stems from this complex mix of things, like our past experiences, our beliefs.
Oh, I see.
Even our current emotional state.
That makes sense. It's like it builds on itself.
Exactly.
So it's not just about ignoring the insult itself, but understanding that whole process, that whole chain of events.
Yes. And then choosing a different path.
Okay, I'm starting to get it.
Yeah.
But could you give me a real-life example? How does this actually play out?
Of course. Let's say someone cuts you off in traffic.
Ugh, I hate when that happens.
Right. But on the surface, it's a pretty minor annoyance.
I guess so.
But if you're already stressed from a long day, maybe you're running late, haven't eaten, suddenly that minor annoyance can trigger a whole cascade of reactions.
Oh, absolutely. I can see myself getting angry.
Yeah, you start honking, maybe flipping the bird.
Oh, no.
And before you know it, you're in a full-blown road rage incident.
Yikes.
And that's what NongBee GameBoy wants us to see. By understanding this chain of cause and effect, we can start to recognize those trigger points, those moments where we can choose to either escalate or de-escalate.
So we have a choice.
Exactly.
Interesting. So NongBee GameBoy is saying this is especially important in Thai politics.
Yeah, they argue that a lot.
Because intimidation tactics are often used to silence opposition.
Unfortunately, yeah.
I mean, NongBee GameBoy really calls out this behavior.
They do.
They even compare some political figures to, and I quote, thugs ruling the city.
Wow, strong words.
It's pretty intense.
But I think it highlights NongBee GameBoy's point that these tactics often come from a lack of persuasive skills.
You mean if you can't win an argument with reason and logic?
Right, you resort to threats and intimidation.
So it's like they're trying to shut down the conversation instead of engaging with it.
Exactly. And it's interesting what types of insults are used in this context. NongBee GameBoy points out that animal names are common.
Oh, yeah, I remember reading that.
Especially reptiles.
It's kind of weird because, as NongBee GameBoy mentions, some of those animal names are kind of cute.
Right.
But when used in anger, they take on this whole other meaning.
It all comes down to the intention behind the words.
So true. And this gets to another fascinating point NongBee GameBoy makes.
What's that?
The idea that some curse words are universally understood as the worst, no matter the language or culture.
It's interesting. What kind of words are we talking about here?
Well, NongBee GameBoy argues that the most powerful insults usually relate to procreation.
Procreation.
Yeah, the act itself and, well,
The anatomy.
Right.
Wow, that is interesting. But it makes sense when you think about it.
Yeah, I mean, those words are pretty taboo in most societies.
Exactly. And NongBee GameBoy sees this as a reflection of our deepest fears and insecurities. It's like those words tap into something primal, something that triggers a strong reaction in us.
It's almost like they're trying to diminish our very humanity.
That's a great way to put it. It really highlights the importance of understanding the psychology behind these insults.
Yeah. Why do certain words have such a strong impact? What is it about us that gives them power?
Big questions.
Definitely something to think about. But for now, let's shift gears a bit. Let's talk about how we can actually deal with these insults when they come our way.
Okay.
NongBee GameBoy has this great analogy about a barking dog.
Oh, I think I remember that.
It's so simple, but so effective. They suggest we should view those who insult us as, well, a little more than that.
Just like a dog barking.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Just like a dog barking behind a fence, their words are just noise.
I like that. It encourages us to detach from the personal sting of the insult.
Right. To see it as something external that doesn't define us.
Yeah.
Why waste energy barking back at a dog? You won't change its behavior.
Yeah.
And you'll just get more frustrated.
True.
And just like you wouldn't take a dog's barking personally, you can choose not to take these insults personally.
It's about recognizing their words say more about them than they do about you.
Powerful stuff.
So it's a way of protecting ourselves from that negativity.
Right. Without shutting down entirely,
Yeah.
we acknowledge the noise, but we don't let it control us.
Exactly.
And this ties back to that Buddhist concept of non-attachment, right?
Yes. It's the idea that we can observe our thoughts and emotions
Oh, well.
without getting caught up in them. Just like observing a dog barking without feeling the need to bark back.
I love that image. But I have to admit, it sounds pretty challenging.
Yeah.
How do we actually do that in the heat of the moment?
It's tough.
When someone's yelling insults, it's hard to just sit there calmly
It takes practice.
and observe your thoughts.
Definitely. But NongBee GameBoy offers some concrete examples of how this can be done. One of the most powerful is the story of the Brahmin who cursed the Buddha.
Oh, yes. That's a classic.
It really is.
A great example of handling negativity with grace and composure.
Absolutely. Can you refresh our listeners' memory about the story?
Of course. So there was this Brahmin who was furious with his wife
Okay.
because she had become a follower of the Buddha.
Oh, wow.
And in a fit of rage, he decided to curse the Buddha himself.
Directly.
Yep.
Oh.
He shows up and just unleashes this torrent of awful language.
Wow. And how did the Buddha react?
He remains completely unfazed.
Really?
Doesn't get angry, doesn't try to defend himself,
Man.
just listens patiently like he's listening to a child having a tantrum.
That takes incredible inner strength.
For sure. And the story doesn't end there.
Oh. What happens next?
After the Brahmin has worn himself out, the Buddha asks him a simple question.
Okay.
Brahmin, have you ever had guests over and offered them food and drink.
Seems straightforward.
Right. Of course, the Brahmin says yes.
And then?
Buddha asks, what if those guests refuse your offerings? Whose food and drink is it then?
I see where this is going.
It's brilliant.
A simple question, but it cuts to the core of the issue.
Exactly. The Brahmin, still fuming, replies, well, it's still mine, of course.
Of course.
And that's when the Buddha drops the mic.
What does he say?
He says, likewise, Brahmin, your cursing is like food you brought to offer me.
Ooh.
But I did not accept it. So those curses and scoldings still belong to you.
Wow, such a clever analogy.
Right.
It really illustrates that it's not the words themselves that have power. It's our reaction to them.
We have a choice.
We can accept those offerings of negativity, or we can refuse them.
And by refusing them, we don't give them power over us.
Exactly. We're not letting them dictate our emotional state.
It's a profound lesson. Like, true strength isn't about fighting back or controlling others.
It's about mastering our own minds, our own reactions.
So we're talking about a kind of mental jujitsu.
Oh, I like that.
Instead of meeting force with force, we use the opponent's energy against them.
Exactly. We're redirecting that negativity.
We're neutralizing it.
Yes. Without getting caught up in the fight.
Which brings us back to that key idea of knowing ourselves.
Right. Understanding our triggers.
Our tendencies to react.
Exactly. If we understand those, we can start choosing a different path.
That's where the real work begins.
It's not easy to break free from those habits of anger and retaliation.
Definitely not. But with practice and mindfulness, it's possible.
I believe so.
So what are some practical steps we can take to cultivate that mindfulness?
Well, that's a conversation for another deep dive.
All right, fair enough. But for now, I think it's enough to just recognize the possibility.
Yes.
To plant that seed of awareness.
That we don't have to be slaves to our reactions.
We can choose a different way of being.
Beautifully put.
That's a great place to leave it for now. We've covered a lot of ground today.
We have. From the psychology of insults to the wisdom of the Buddha.
It's amazing how NongBee GameBoy weaves together these seemingly different ideas.
It's a really insightful narrative.
It really is. It shows how those timeless principles are just as relevant today as they were centuries ago.
Totally agree.
So to our listeners, we hope this deep dive has given you some food for thought.
Some new tools for navigating those inevitable challenges.
And maybe a renewed appreciation for the power of mindfulness.
And the potential of choosing peace over conflict.
Beautifully said. We'll be back soon with more from NongBee GameBoy's blog. Until then, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep learning.
Keep diving deep. It's fascinating how NongBee GameBoy brings in Shakespeare here.
Right. That quote from Hamlet.
There is nothing either good or bad, but thinking makes it so.
It's like it sums up this whole conversation.
It really does. It's not the insult itself, the external stuff.
It's our internal world, our thoughts that shape how we feel.
Exactly.
So even if we can't avoid those negative people, we can choose how we react.
That's the key. That's where the real power is. We might not control what people say or do, but we can control our response.
We can let their words get to us, or we can cultivate that inner peace.
Exactly. And that brings us back to that letting go of the self idea.
Is that even possible?
Well, it's not easy.
It sounds really tough.
It takes a deep understanding of Buddhist philosophy and a lot of practice. But even if we can't totally erase the ego, we can loosen its grip a bit, become more aware of those knee-jerk reactions.
So more mindfulness, more awareness of our thoughts.
Yes. And with awareness comes choice. We can choose to be angry, or we can choose another path.
We can choose to engage, or just let it go. It's amazing how NongBee GameBoy mixes these ancient Buddhist teachings with modern examples.
They do a great job of that.
Thai politics and Shakespeare. Who knew they had so much to say about handling insults?
It shows these principles are universal, timeless,
Totally. So to recap, we've got that dependent origination idea.
How our reactions fuel the negativity.
The power of knowing ourselves and choosing how we respond.
Right.
And that mind-blowing concept of letting go of the self.
To detach from the sting of those insults.
It's like a whole toolkit.
For navigating a world that can feel, well, pretty hostile sometimes.
No kidding. I'm still stuck on that barking dog analogy, though.
It is a good one.
So simple, but so profound.
It reminds us that sometimes the best response is no response at all.
Like, why bother barking back? It's just noise.
Exactly. Sometimes it's wiser to just observe, acknowledge the noise, but don't let it control you.
And that applies to so much more than just insults, right?
Absolutely.
It's about recognizing what we can control and what we can't.
Precisely. We can't control what others say or do, but we can control our reaction.
We can let those things dictate how we feel. Or we can choose that inner peace. So what does this all mean for our listeners? What are the key takeaways?
I think NongBee GameBoy offers a real challenge. To question how we think about anger and retaliation. Recognize the limits of intimidation. And the power of choosing our response.
Right.
To explore letting go of the self and finding freedom from that negativity.
Powerful stuff. And maybe to see those who insult us not as enemies,
but
as those barking dogs behind the fence.
Just making noise.
And remember, as Shakespeare put it, there is nothing either good or bad.
But thinking makes it so.
Something to think about. So if our thinking gives power to those insults, what else in our lives could benefit from this perspective?
That's a great question. I think NongBee GameBoy would encourage us to think about that, to take this wisdom beyond just insults.
Like maybe dealing with difficult people.
Right, or even just everyday frustrations, the little things that get under our skin.
We often give so much power to those external circumstances.
Yes.
So NongBee GameBoy is tackling this whole idea of how to handle negativity from other people.
Okay.
And specifically insults.
Uh-huh.
And they start with this concept that we've all heard before. Turn the other cheek.
Right.
But then they ask, like, how realistic is that?
Yeah.
Especially when things get really heated.
Yeah.
Like, imagine someone's not just disagreeing with you, but, like, escalating to personal attacks.
Yeah.
Does turning the other cheek still apply?
That's where things get really tricky, right? Because blindly enduring abuse doesn't seem healthy or wise.
Exactly.
It's just not practical.
And NongBee GameBoy brings in this Buddhist principle called paticca-samuppada,
Okay.
which essentially means cause and effect.
Okay.
And it's this idea that, like, think about a time someone said something that, like, really set you off.
Uh-huh.
Your reaction probably just made the situation worse, right?
Right.
That's paticca-samuppada in action.
Right.
Like, our actions, even if we feel justified in the moment,
Mm-hmm.
create these ripples that come back to us.
Yeah, it's a powerful concept for sure.
Yeah.
And it's not about being a doormat or anything like that, but it's just understanding that retaliation,
Right.
even verbal retaliation,
Yeah.
just fuels the fire.
Totally.
It creates more suffering for everybody involved.
So instead of this, like, almost impossible ideal of always turning the other cheek,
Right.
we can maybe focus on understanding the consequences of our reactions.
Yeah.
Which honestly feels a lot more doable.
Absolutely. It shifts the focus from like some superhuman level of compassion
Right.
to just a more practical understanding of how our actions shape our reality.
Totally.
And that can be empowering because it gives us a choice
Yeah.
in how we respond.
It's like instead of getting swept up in that wave of anger,
Right.
we can pause and choose a different course of action.
Exactly.
Speaking of anger, NongBee GameBoy shares this really vivid anecdote about experiencing their own anger.
Okay.
They describe feeling their breath get shallow and their hands trembling.
Yeah.
It's almost like they're watching their anger take over physically.
Oh, I remember that passage.
Yeah.
It's really striking.
Yeah.
It highlights how anger can manifest in our bodies before we're even fully aware of it.
Which leads perfectly into the second technique they discuss,
Okay.
which is learning to see your anger in action before it controls you.
Okay.
They talk about mindfulness practices, basically being present in the moment as a way to spot those early signs of anger
Right.
before they escalate.
So it's about creating space between the feeling and the reaction.
Yes.
Like instead of immediately lashing out, we can observe the anger, acknowledge it's there, and let it pass without letting it control us.
They compare it to like watching a storm pass by.
Oh, yeah.
You don't try to stop the storm.
Right.
You just observe it and let it run its course.
Exactly. And that observation gives us the power to choose a different response.
Yeah.
We might still feel angry,
Right.
but we don't have to be ruled by it.
It's so powerful.
Have you ever noticed those physical signs of anger, like in yourself or others?
Oh, for sure. Like sometimes my jaw will clench.
Yeah.
Or I'll notice my heart rate increase.
Cool.
And it's like a warning sign. Like, okay, something's happening here.
Right. What techniques do you use to like manage that anger when you feel it coming on?
Sometimes I'll just like take a few deep breaths.
Yeah.
Or try to remove myself from the situation for a minute.
Yeah.
Just to like get some perspective.
That's great.
Yeah. It's definitely a skill worth developing.
Like, how many arguments could we avoid
Right.
if we were all better at recognizing and managing our own anger?
Absolutely. And NongBee GameBoy offers a third technique, which is a little bit more mind-bending.
Okay.
They ask this thought-provoking question. If someone insults you
Okay.
and there is no you who is offended.
Okay. That one really made me stop and think.
Right.
What does it even mean to say there's no you?
It gets into this Buddhist concept of self as being an illusion.
Okay.
Like we tend to identify with our thoughts, our feelings, our experiences, and create this solid idea of who we are.
Right.
But NongBee GameBoy suggests that this self is more like a construct, a story we tell ourselves,
Okay.
rather than some fixed, unchanging entity.
So it's not that we don't exist,
Right.
but that who we think we are is maybe more fluid and less defined than we realize.
Exactly. And to illustrate this, NongBee GameBoy uses what they call the container analogy,
Okay, I'm intrigued. Let's unpack this container analogy.
because I think it's key to understanding this whole no self idea.
It's such a helpful visual.
Okay.
So imagine a container,
Okay.
like a mug or a jar, anything that holds something.
Uh-huh.
That container represents our sense of self,
Okay.
the I or me that we cling to.
So it's like the persona we present to the world,
Precisely.
the image we have of ourselves.
Exactly. And the water inside the container.
Okay.
That represents our true essence, our being.
Uh-huh.
Now imagine someone insults the container.
Okay.
They say it's ugly or cracked or whatever.
Right.
Does that actually damage the water inside?
I see where you're going with this.
Yeah.
The insult is directed at the container, not the essence within.
Right. And NongBee GameBoy goes even further, saying that the size and material of the container
Okay.
represent different levels of ego and sensitivity.
So like someone with a thin glass container might be really easily hurt by criticism,
Exactly.
while someone with a thick metal container might just shrug it off.
Yeah.
So the container analogy is basically saying that how we react to insults
Yes.
depends on how tightly we're clinging to this idea of self.
Exactly. And the more we can detach from that self, the less power insults have over us.
Which brings us to the million-dollar question.
Yes.
How do we actually do that?
Right.
How do we loosen the grip on this self and lessen the impact of those inevitable insults?
It's the big question, isn't it?
Yeah.
Well, NongBee GameBoy has some practical exercises for that too.
Okay.
But we'll dive into those in the next part of our deep dive.
Sounds good. I'm looking forward to it.
Stay tuned.
All right, we'll be right back.
That container analogy really got me thinking.
Right.
Yeah, it's like I can almost visualize my own container and how easily it gets dented by criticism.
Me too. It's so relatable.
Yeah.
And NongBee GameBoy actually dives deeper into like the different types of containers.
Oh, okay.
Which I found really interesting. Remember how they said the size and material can represent different levels of ego and sensitivity?
Yes. It's like the bigger and more fragile the container, the more easily it's going to be affected by external stuff.
Totally. And they even talk about the shape of the container.
Okay.
Like someone with a prickly personality, their container might have all these sharp edges that make it more prone to damage. It's almost like they're unconsciously inviting conflict.
That's a great point. It's like they've built this fortress around themselves.
Yes.
But it's made of brittle glass instead of sturdy stone.
Right.
So any little bump feels like a major threat.
Exactly. But then NongBee GameBoy asks this really challenging question.
Okay.
Can we break the container altogether?
Now, that's where things get really interesting.
Right.
But also a bit daunting.
Yeah.
Because, let's be honest, we're so used to identifying with this container.
Totally.
The sense of self. The idea of dismantling it can feel almost terrifying.
Right. It's like if I'm not my thoughts, my feelings, my experiences, then who am I?
Right.
What's left?
That's the big question, isn't it? And NongBee GameBoy acknowledges that it's a long process.
Yeah.
A journey that requires a deep understanding of Buddhist principles. And a lot of practice. They emphasize that it's not about erasing our individuality.
Okay, good.
Or becoming some kind of emotionless zombie.
Thank goodness for that. I was getting a little worried there for a second.
Right. But what they're pointing to is this idea that our true essence is far more vast and expansive than this limited sense of self we've created.
Right.
It's like we've spent our whole lives building and decorating this container.
Yeah.
But we've forgotten about the boundless ocean that exists beyond its walls.
Wow. That's a powerful image. So how do we even begin to break down those walls? What does dismantling the self actually look like in practice?
Well, NongBee GameBoy talks about cultivating certain qualities,
right,
like mindfulness, compassion, and non-attachment. It's about recognizing the impermanence of everything, including our own thoughts and feelings.
So instead of clinging to those thoughts and feelings as if they define us, we learn to observe them without judgment and let them pass.
Exactly. And as we do that, the walls of the container start to become more transparent.
Okay.
We start to see that our true essence is not bound by those limitations.
Okay, I have to be honest. This all sounds very abstract and philosophical.
Yeah.
Are there any practical exercises we can do to start chipping away at that container?
Absolutely. Remember those 2 questions NongBee GameBoy suggests we ask ourselves before reacting to any situation.
Yes.
Who is doing this and is this necessary?
Oh, yeah. Those questions are brilliant.
They're deceptively simple, but so powerful.
Yeah.
Because by asking who is doing this, we're immediately creating some distance between ourselves and the emotion we're experiencing. It's like instead of saying I'm angry, we're observing that there's anger present. But it doesn't have to define us.
And then the second question, is this necessary? Forces us to pause and consider whether our reaction is actually serving us.
Right.
Or if it's just perpetuating the cycle of negativity.
Exactly. It's like that moment in a movie where everything slows down and the hero has a choice to make, fight or walk away.
Yeah.
By asking that question, we're giving ourselves the opportunity to choose a different path, one that's aligned with our values and intentions.
It's like we're taking back control of the narrative.
Precisely.
Instead of letting our emotions run the show.
And as we practice this, as we become more mindful of our thoughts and actions, we start to weaken the grip of the ego. The container becomes less solid, more permeable.
It's almost like we're slowly dissolving the walls of the container.
Yeah.
Allowing our true essence to shine through more brightly.
That's such a beautiful way to put it.
Thanks.
And as that happens, we become less reactive to insults and negativity.
Right.
Because we recognize that they're not actually directed at our true selves, but at this temporary constructed identity.
It's like the insults just bounce off because they're hitting a surface that's no longer solid.
Exactly. And this reminds me of something else NongBee GameBoy brings up.
Okay.
The Buddhist principle of Padikasamuppada, cause and effect.
Right.
When someone insults us, it's often a reflection of their own pain or suffering.
It's like that saying, hurt people hurt people.
Exactly. And by understanding this principle, we can cultivate a sense of compassion for the person who's lashing out. We recognize that their actions are often driven by ignorance or a lack of awareness rather than malice.
So instead of taking it personally, we can see it as an opportunity to practice patience and understanding.
Yes, and that doesn't mean condoning their behavior.
Right.
But simply choosing not to engage in that cycle of negativity.
Totally.
Yeah.
Which brings us back to NongBee GameBoy's favorite technique.
Yes.
Don't bark back at the dog.
I love that analogy.
Me too. It's so simple, yet so profound.
Right. Sometimes the most powerful response is no response at all. Or at least not a reactive one. We can choose to respond with kindness, compassion, or even silence.
And those responses, while they might not feel as satisfying in the moment, ultimately contribute to a more peaceful and harmonious world.
Absolutely. Yeah. Because every time we choose not to react with anger or aggression, We're breaking the cycle of negativity.
We're creating a ripple effect of peace.
Yes.
One interaction at a time.
And that, I think, is a beautiful thing to aspire to. But before we get too carried away with the warm fuzzies,
Okay.
I want to pose a question to our listener.
Okay.
How much of your identity do you tie to external validation or labels?
Ooh, that's a good one.
And what would it mean for you to loosen the grip of that self?
It's a deep question, and one that I think is worth revisiting from time to time.
Yeah.
As we continue on this journey of self-discovery.
Because as we learn to dismantle that container, that illusion of self, we create space for something far more beautiful and expansive to emerge. Our true essence shining brightly and illuminating the world around us. But there's more to explore in NongBee GameBoy's blog.
Okay.
So stay tuned for the final part of our deep dive.
It's amazing to think, like, how much energy we put into building up this idea of ourselves.
Yeah.
This container.
It really is. Like, we spend so much time trying to protect this image we have of ourselves that any little nick or scratch feels like a major attack.
And NongBee GameBoy makes a great point, that this clinging to the self
Right.
is at the root of so much suffering.
Yes.
Like, it's what fuels our desires, our anger, our insecurities, our attachments to things that don't really matter in the grand scheme of things.
It's what keeps us trapped in this constant cycle of wanting more, better, different.
Right.
We're always chasing some external thing
Yeah.
to make us feel complete,
Right.
to validate this fragile sense of self.
But what if, like, NongBee GameBoy suggests we could actually break free from that illusion?
Yeah.
What if we could let go of the container altogether?
That's the ultimate goal in Buddhism,
Oh, wait.
to reach a state of enlightenment,
Uh.
where the self is no longer a source of stammering.
Right.
It's about experiencing the world
Mm-hmm.
with a sense of clarity, compassion, and peace,
Right.
no matter what's happening around us. And this is part 3,
Part 3.
which is self and the Lord Buddha.
Ooh, that's a good one.
So we're talking about the Buddhist concept of self.
I love it.
And you know those conversations that everyone says to avoid?
Like politics and religion?
Yeah, politics, religion, all that.
Yeah.
NongBee GameBoy is kind of suggesting that maybe there's a way to approach even those hot-button topics.
Interesting.
And it all hinges on how Buddhists view the self.
Okay. I'm intrigued already.
So NongBee GameBoy doesn't shy away from the big questions here.
That's what I like about him.
He connects this ancient concept of self to modern psychology
Uh-huh.
and even throws in some personal anecdotes about how it's played out in his own life.
Sounds like a great read.
Okay, so let's get this straight right off the bat.
NongBee GameBoy is arguing that our self is an illusion.
That's a bold statement.
That sounds pretty radical, right?
Yeah, it does sound radical at first, but
All right.
when you really think about it, it's not that we don't exist,
Right.
but it's that this idea of a fixed, unchanging self is an illusion.
So it's more like the idea of a permanent me.
Exactly.
That's an illusion.
Yeah, that's the illusion. NongBee GameBoy uses this great analogy.
Okay.
He says, imagine your body and mind as a temporary vehicle,
Okay.
a lump of flesh and minds, his words, roaming this earth,
Wow.
and not your true essence.
That's a pretty vivid image.
Right.
But okay, so if this self isn't really real
Yeah.
in the way that we usually think about it,
Uh-huh.
how does that actually change anything?
Well, think about it this way.
Okay.
How do you react when someone insults you?
Oh boy.
Right.
I get defensive.
Exactly. You get defensive because you're attached to this idea of a fixed self. So that insult feels like a personal attack on your very being.
Yeah, I can definitely relate to that.
Right.
But
it triggers all sorts of defensive reactions.
if we can loosen the grip on this idea of self,
Yeah.
does that mean insults just wouldn't bother us at all?
Well, NongBee GameBoy addresses that directly.
Okay.
He says it's not about becoming emotionless robots.
Yep.
It's more about lessening the intensity of our reactions.
So we still feel anger,
You still feel anger,
sadness,
sadness,
All right.
joy, all of it.
joy.
But you don't let those emotions completely control you.
So there's like a space
Yeah.
between ourselves and our reactions.
Exactly. You're creating space.
Okay.
And NongBee GameBoy suggests that this detachment from self
Okay.
can be applied to all sorts of situations,
Yeah.
even those difficult conversations
Oh, I see where this is going.
about politics and religion.
So if I'm less attached to my own opinions and beliefs,
Yeah,
I might be more open to hearing other viewpoints
precisely.
without feeling so personally threatened.
Exactly. It allows for a more nuanced and less reactive approach
That makes sense.
to those conversations that
Yeah.
tend to trigger strong emotions.
This is really interesting.
It is right.
So NongBee GameBoy has a whole section
He does.
about what might happen if we could fully detach from the self.
Mhm.
And it sounds pretty profound,
It is profound.
like kind of mind-blowing.
It is mind-blowing. He doesn't claim to have all the answers,
Right.
but he explores some really fascinating possibilities.
Wait.
He even connects this Buddhist concept to modern physics.
Wait, physics? How does that even tie in?
He compares the Buddhist concept of nirvana,
Okay.
you know, that state of complete liberation from suffering,
Yeah.
to the wave-like nature of reality.
Oh.
That's described in quantum physics.
That's a lot to unpack.
It is a mind-blowing idea.
Yeah, before we dive into nirvana and quantum physics, let's
Yeah.
bring it back to NongBee GameBoy's main point.
Okay.
If detaching from this fixed sense of self can have such a profound impact on how we react to the world,
Yeah.
how do we even begin to cultivate this selflessness?
That's where NongBee GameBoy brings in the teachings of the Buddha himself,
Okay.
who essentially laid out a roadmap
Okay.
for understanding and ultimately transcending the illusion of self.
So the Buddha had a plan.
He did. A roadmap for us. You know, it's interesting because NongBee GameBoy makes this point that you don't have to become a Buddhist monk to actually benefit from these ideas.
You don't have to go live in a cave?
Yeah, exactly. You don't have to go live in a cave.
Okay, good.
He talks about the Buddhist teachings as a practical guide to navigating everyday life.
That makes this whole detaching from self thing feel a lot less intimidating.
Exactly.
I don't have to shave my head.
You don't have to shave your head.
But how does this play out in real life?
Okay, so think about the last time you got into a heated argument.
Ooh, yeah.
Maybe about politics or even something small. Chances are you were pretty attached to your own point of view.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
You wanted to win.
I can be pretty stubborn.
To prove the other person wrong.
Especially when I feel strongly about something.
That's natural. But NongBee GameBoy suggests that if we can approach those situations with a little less self-involved,
less ego,
it can completely change the dynamic.
Okay.
Instead of clinging to our own opinions, we can become more curious about the other person's perspective.
So it's like shifting from this battle of egos to a genuine attempt to understand each other.
And that's where NongBee GameBoy brings in this idea of seeing the grayness of issues.
I like that.
He argues that most things aren't black and white.
The grayness of issues.
Right or wrong.
Yeah.
There are often multiple perspectives.
It's so true.
Each with its own valid points.
How much energy do we waste trying to force everything into these categories?
Right.
Like it has to be this or that.
Exactly.
But we loosen our grip on that.
That need to be right.
That need to be right all the time.
All the time, yeah.
Maybe we can start to see the nuances.
The complexities.
Of different viewpoints.
Yeah, I like that.
And it's something that NongBee GameBoy has clearly put into practice himself.
He walks the walk.
He does. He even talks about how applying these Buddhist principles has helped him in his personal life.
Oh, okay.
He mentions a book called Difficult Conversations.
Oh, yeah, I heard of that.
Have you heard of that?
Yeah.
It's all about how to navigate those tough conversations.
Yeah, those tough conversations.
And NongBee GameBoy draws this fascinating parallel between the techniques outlined in that book and the Buddhist teachings.
So we're not just talking about abstract philosophy here. We're talking about real-world tools.
Real-world tools.
For improving our communication.
Yes.
And relationships.
Precisely.
I like it.
And NongBee GameBoy even shares a personal anecdote.
Does he really?
About how he successfully used one of the techniques from difficult conversations.
Oh, wow. He describes it as a, wow, it really works moment.
I love that.
It's great.
What did he find so helpful?
He highlights the importance of active listening.
Oh, that's a tough one.
Really trying to understand the other person's perspective.
Yeah.
Without interrupting.
Oh, man. I'm so guilty of that.
Or immediately jumping in to defend your own point of view.
Especially when I feel passionate about something.
We all are. But NongBee GameBoy suggests that if we can practice this kind of deep listening, it can create a space for genuine understanding and connection, even when there's disagreement.
So replace that combat mode with more open,
curious
approach.
Exactly. And this ties back to the Buddhist principle of detaching from self. When we're less invested in being right all the time, we can actually listen to what the other person is saying without feeling threatened or defensive.
It sounds like a recipe for more productive and less stressful conversation.
Less stressful, for sure.
But is there a risk of becoming too passive?
That's a good question.
If we're constantly detaching from our own opinions.
NongBee GameBoy addresses that directly.
Okay, good.
He emphasizes that detaching from self isn't about becoming a doormat. Or suppressing your own feelings.
So how do we strike that balance?
It's about finding that sweet spot between holding on to our values and beliefs without clinging to them so tightly that we become rigid and inflexible. It's about being open to learning and growing.
I like that.
Even if that means challenging our own assumptions.
So detaching from self isn't about erasing our identity. But about expanding it.
That's a great way to put it.
But what about those really big questions? About the nature of self and reality. You know, we touched on nirvana earlier. That state of complete liberation from suffering. Is that something we can actually achieve?
That's where things get really deep. NongBee GameBoy doesn't shy away from these big questions.
Good.
He even draws this fascinating parallel between the Buddhist understanding of nirvana and the wave-like nature of reality described in quantum physics.
Now we're getting into some mind-bending territory.
I know, right?
I'm not sure I'm ready for a full-blown physics lesson.
We don't have to go full physics. But I'm definitely intrigued.
How does quantum physics relate to Buddhism?
So both quantum physics and Buddhism, they challenge our everyday assumptions about reality. Quantum physics tells us that the world isn't as solid and predictable
as we think it is.
As it seems. Things exist in a state of potentiality, constantly in flux.
So instead of seeing the world as made up of separate independent objects, we're starting to understand that everything is interconnected.
And constantly changing. Exactly. And this aligns with the Buddhist view of reality as impermanent and interconnected. The concept of nirvana points to a state of being where we fully realize this interconnectedness and let go of our attachment to a separate fixed self.
That's a pretty radical shift in perspective.
It is.
I'm still struggling with the idea of completely letting go of the self.
I understand.
Doesn't that mean we lose our individuality?
That's a common misconception.
Okay.
NongBee GameBoy clarifies that detaching from self doesn't mean becoming a blank slate or losing our unique personality and experiences.
So it's not about erasing our identity.
It's about recognizing that our sense of self is more fluid and interconnected.
But about expanding our understanding of what identity even means.
That's a great way to put it.
That leads us to NongBee GameBoy's exploration of the Buddha himself.
The man who embodied this understanding of self and reality.
I'm eager to delve into that.
He dedicated his life to sharing these insights with the world, offering a path to liberation from suffering.
It's amazing to think that he was exploring these ideas.
I know, it's incredible.
Thousands of years ago. Does NongBee GameBoy think the Buddhist teachings are still relevant today?
Oh, absolutely. He contrasts the consistency of Buddhist teachings with other belief systems, that have had to adapt over time. He even points out, and this is funny, nobody's accusing non-believers of witchcraft these days.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So, it's interesting to think about that.
So the Buddha's insights have stood the test of time.
Exactly. And remember, the Buddha wasn't just offering spiritual musings.
Right.
He provided a practical framework for living a better life.
Okay.
NongBee GameBoy highlights how the Buddhist teachings cover everything from managing emotions and finances to navigating relationships and fulfilling social roles.
It sounds like the Buddha was the original life coach.
That's a great way to put it. Offering wisdom for every aspect of human experience.
It's incredible to think that he was doing this.
Well, right.
Centuries before modern psychology.
Yeah. NongBee GameBoy even compares the Buddha's teachings to a detailed psychology model of the human mind.
So modern psychology is just catching up.
In some ways, yeah.
To what the Buddha already knew.
There are definitely some really striking parallels.
It's not just about blind faith then.
No.
It's about understanding the underlying principles of reality.
And then applying that knowledge to live a more fulfilling life.
That makes sense, and this brings us back to that book.
Difficult Conversations.
Yeah, Difficult Conversations.
There's a strong connection there.
Between
the book's approach to communication and the Buddha's approach to understanding the human condition.
So they both offer practical strategies.
Yeah, for navigating complex situations and finding solutions.
And NongBee GameBoy even shares a story about using one of those techniques.
He does.
Having that aha moment.
That wow, it really works moment.
Oh, I love those.
Yeah, me too.
But for our listeners who might be new to this whole thing, can you give us a quick rundown of Difficult Conversations?
So Difficult Conversations is a book that offers advice on how to handle those challenging conversations.
Which we all have to face at some point.
Like disagreements with loved ones or conflicts at work.
Right.
Even those tough conversations about politics and religion.
Right.
Or provides a framework for communicating more effectively and finding common ground.
Even when
emotions are running high.
That sounds so useful.
It is.
And I can see how it ties back to these Buddhist principles.
Absolutely.
If we can detach from our own ego.
Yeah.
Approach those conversations with more curiosity and compassion.
It's more likely we'll find a resolution that works for everyone.
Exactly. And NongBee GameBoy seems to agree.
Okay.
He ends his blog post with this question. What's Bee's 2 cents?
Oh, I like that.
Like he's inviting us to continue the conversation.
To share our own thoughts and experiences.
Exactly.
So we'd like to extend that invitation to you, our listeners.
And we're still on Chapter 3, KNOWC. Know the others or your conversation partners.
Right.
And in case you're just tuning in, this is all written by NongBee GameBoy, who actually calls himself Bee in the blog.
I like it.
Me too.
It's very personable.
Yeah. It makes it feel more relatable.
Yeah.
So last time we talked about how Bee stresses that we need to know ourselves before going into one of these difficult conversations. And this time we're going to talk about the other side of that coin. Knowing the other person.
Yeah, and he really goes beyond just know the other person. Like, he gives us
I love that.
Different types of people we might encounter in these situations.
Yeah. So give me an example of one of those types.
Okay, so let's say you're at a family gathering.
Oh.
And somebody brings up like a hot button political topic.
Oh, no.
And then like your Uncle Bob starts going on a rant, like just total anger, not even letting anyone else talk.
No, we all have an Uncle Bob.
Right, so B calls that the angry demeanor type.
Okay. So what does he say we should do about that? Like, how do you deal with somebody who's just like a volcano of anger?
So he actually suggests that sometimes the best approach with these angry types is avoidance.
Really? Just avoid them?
If you can, yeah.
But what if you can't?
Right. Well, obviously, there are going to be some situations where you can't avoid them.
Like at a family dinner, you can't just leave Aunt Carol to deal with Uncle Bob.
Exactly.
Poor Aunt Carol.
So in those cases, when avoidance isn't an option, then he says it's super important to understand how that person communicates and kind of tailor your approach accordingly.
Okay, so how do you tailor your approach when somebody's just like spouting anger?
Well, I mean, think about what's behind anger. Often, it's that people feel like they're not being heard or understood.
That makes sense.
So with someone like Uncle Bob, like just staying calm, really listening to what they're saying and acknowledging their feelings.
Even if you don't agree with them.
Yeah, even if you totally disagree, that can really go a long way.
So it's less about like winning the argument and more about just like de-escalating.
Exactly. It's not about becoming a doormat. It's just kind of shifting your focus.
Yeah.
Away from winning and more towards managing the conversation.
That makes a lot of sense.
Okay.
Okay, so that's the angry type. Are there other personality types we should be aware of? Like, is there kind of a one-size-fits-all approach?
Well, not exactly. Like, he also has another category that he calls blind faith demeanors.
Okay. What does that mean?
So these are the people who are so stuck in their beliefs that they're like completely closed off to anything else.
Right, yeah. The people who are like immune to logic and facts.
Exactly. They're just operating purely on faith.
So how do you have a conversation with somebody like that?
Honestly, he admits that these can be really, really hard conversations.
I bet.
He suggests that instead of trying to like directly attack their beliefs,
which will probably just make them defensive.
Right. So instead of doing that, maybe you could try appealing to shared values, like finding some common ground.
So like if someone's really religious and you're not, you could maybe focus on things like compassion or helping people.
Exactly.
So you kind of like sidestep the debate about religion.
Right. It's all about finding a connection, like some shared humanity that can bridge that gap.
This is so interesting. It's like Bee's giving us this roadmap for these conversational minefields.
Right.
Recognizing that different people need different approaches.
Yeah. It's not about being manipulative. It's more about meeting people where they are.
Right.
And communicating in a way that works for them.
I like that. Okay, so we've got the angry types and we've got the blind faith types.
Right.
Are there any other types? And maybe more importantly, are there any types that are easy to talk to?
Well, you're in luck.
Yeah.
Because Bee does have one type that he calls emotionally mature intellects.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I like that. So who are they? Are they like unicorns? Are they real?
Well, he admits that they're pretty rare.
Okay.
But they are out there.
Okay.
He describes them as people who are not only smart, but also emotionally balanced.
Okay.
Open-minded and willing to learn.
So are those the people who can like have a thoughtful debate without it turning into a personal attack?
Exactly. They're like the holy grail of conversation partners.
Yeah.
And he contrasts these folks with what he calls wise asses,
Oh.
who might be smart, but they don't have that emotional maturity.
Yeah. So they just want to show off how smart they are.
Right. Exactly.
Okay. So they're out there. These emotionally mature intellects.
They are.
They're rare, but they're out there. So does that mean that most of our difficult conversations are just doomed to fail? Like, are we just going to end up shouting at each other?
Well, not necessarily.
Okay.
Remember, Bee's giving us this framework to understand the people we're talking to. So even if we don't always find that perfect conversation partner, just being aware of these different types can really help us approach the conversation more skillfully and intentionally.
So it's like a cheat sheet for human interaction.
Kind of, yeah. And it's not about manipulating people. It's about being more aware of the dynamics at play.
Okay.
And this brings us to one of Bee's most insightful points. He says, open mind makes you smarter.
Now that is something I can get behind.
Right.
But what does he mean by that?
That is a great question.
Okay.
And one that we should probably delve into a little deeper.
Okay, so before we got sidetracked, we were talking about how Bee thinks that open mind makes you smarter.
Right.
Which sounds great, in theory, but what does that actually look like? Like when you're in one of these difficult conversations,
You're right.
What does it really mean to have an open mind?
Yeah, that's a great question.
Especially when you're dealing with somebody who just sees things completely differently than you.
Right, because it's easy to say open mind, open mind.
Right.
But what does that actually mean in practice?
Yeah. Does it mean you just have to agree with them?
Right.
Or pretend to agree with them? Because that doesn't seem very helpful or genuine.
No, I don't think that's what he's getting at. I think it's more about actively engaging with their perspective.
Okay.
Even if you don't agree with it.
Right.
Like really listening, asking questions, and really trying to understand where they're coming from.
So it's more about being curious than it is about agreeing.
Yeah. Exactly.
Okay.
Like recognizing that even in the conversations that feel like they're going nowhere, there's always something to be learned.
Okay.
Not just about the topic,
right,
but also about the other person.
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. And it reminds me of what Bee was saying about how he struggles too.
Oh, right.
With these conversations sometimes.
Yeah. He told that story about trying to talk to one of his close friends.
Yeah. And he's a famous writer too.
Yeah. Famous writer. And he just hit a wall.
I love that he admits that.
Yeah.
It makes him seem more human.
Right. Like he's not just some perfect communication guru
right,
who never has any problems.
He's right there in the trenches with us.
Exactly.
Okay. So, but remind me what happened with the writer friend.
Okay. So they were talking about something. And no matter what Bee tried, his friend just couldn't see past his initial point of view. So it led to a total communication breakdown. And Bee even linked back to one of his old blog posts about emotional freedom, where he was talking about this very thing.
So even if you do everything right, sometimes the conversation just isn't going to go anywhere.
It seems that way. Like you just can't force someone to be open-minded.
No matter how good your communication skills are.
That's both encouraging and discouraging at the same time.
It is.
It means we can't always control the outcome.
True.
But we can control how we approach it.
Exactly. Like we can choose to be open-minded.
Right.
To listen.
Yeah.
And to learn.
Yeah.
Even if the other person isn't willing to do the same.
So it's not about guaranteeing that the conversation is going to be successful.
Right.
It's about maximizing our chances.
Exactly.
By focusing on what we can control, like our own mindset and our own communication style.
And that brings us back to open mind makes you smarter.
Right.
Because when we go into conversations with that curiosity and that willingness to learn, we're open to new information, new ideas, new possibilities.
Okay. I'm starting to see how all of this fits together now.
Yeah.
It's not just about being nice or avoiding conflict. It's about recognizing that having an open mind is actually crucial for us to grow and learn.
Right. And to connect with other people, even when we don't agree with them.
Exactly. And that's a really powerful idea, especially in a world that feels increasingly polarized.
Yeah.
Like Bee's reminding us that it's still possible and important to have these conversations, build bridges, and to understand each other.
Okay, so I'm sold.
Good.
But how do we actually do this? Like knowing about all these different types of people and knowing that we need to have an open mind, that's great. But are there any like concrete tips?
That's a great question. And that's actually what he talks about in the next chapter, which is all about communication skills.
Perfect.
But before we jump into that, I'm curious, what are your biggest takeaways so far?
I think what's really sticking with me is that it's not just about techniques and strategies. It's about cultivating the right mindset.
Yeah.
Like these conversations are opportunities for us to grow.
Right.
Even if they don't always go the way we want them to go.
I love that.
Yeah.
Yeah. It shifts the focus from winning to learning.
Exactly.
And it reminds me that we need to be self-aware.
Oh, yeah.
Bee talks about knowing yourself.
Yeah.
But it seems like it's an ongoing process to become a better communicator.
Absolutely. Like recognizing our own biases and our own triggers and just our own patterns.
Right.
So we can communicate authentically.
Right. And that ultimately makes us more effective, not just in these tough situations, but in all of our communication.
Okay. So we've covered a lot of ground here.
We have.
From different personality types to open minds. And it sounds like Bee got even more wisdom to drop on us in this next chapter about communication skills.
Absolutely. I'm excited to get into it.
Okay, so we spent all this time talking about understanding ourselves and other people.
Right.
But I mean, where does that actually leave us? Like, what should our listeners do when they're faced with these like real life difficult conversations?
You know, it's funny because we often get so caught up in what we should say.
Right.
Like what's the perfect argument or comeback or whatever.
Right. Yeah.
But Bee seems to be saying that it's really more about how we approach the whole thing.
Yeah.
It's like the mindset we bring to the table is actually more important.
Right. Like he's basically saying it's not about winning.
Right.
It's about actually understanding the other person.
Exactly. And remembering that sometimes it's just not going to be productive.
Yeah.
Like we talked about Bee's experience with his writer friend.
Right. You can't make somebody be open-minded if they don't want to be.
Right. Exactly.
But maybe we can create a better space for the conversation.
Yeah.
By focusing on being open-minded ourselves.
And that's where that idea of open mind makes you smarter comes in.
Okay, yeah.
It's not about just being agreeable.
Right.
It's about understanding that when we shut ourselves off to other viewpoints, we're actually limiting our own growth.
So it's not just about the big debates, you know, like the political stuff or religion. It's about how we approach all our conversations.
Yes.
Even the little everyday ones.
All of them.
With curiosity and a willingness to actually learn something.
Exactly. And you can really see how Bee's background comes into play here.
Oh, yeah.
That blend of Buddhist principles and psychology.
Right.
It's about finding that inner peace.
Yeah.
So we can be more understanding.
Yeah.
Even when we disagree.
So it's not just about communication. It's like a whole way of being in the world.
I like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is. And it actually makes me think about how technology plays into all this.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Because it's so easy nowadays to just filter out anything we don't agree with.
Right. Like social media can be an echo chamber.
It totally is.
It's like we're losing the ability to have a good disagreement.
I think you're right.
But Bee's giving us some tools to push back against that.
He is.
Like it's not about avoiding those tough topics or just pretending we agree with everyone.
No, it's about engaging thoughtfully and respectfully.
Okay, so to wrap things up.
Yeah.
What would you say is the most important thing for our listeners to remember?
I think it's this. Those tough conversations.
Yeah.
Even though they can be hard, they're really important for us to grow, to build relationships, and to make the world a more understanding place.
I love that. So to all our listeners out there, don't shy away from those conversations.
Go into them.
Go into them with self-awareness, with empathy, and with an open mind.
And remember, open mind makes you smarter.
Absolutely.
Know how to communicate.
Okay.
And it's by a blogger named NongBee GameBoy. So yeah, Thai blogosphere. And just to add another layer of interesting, it's a chapter on communication advice.
Interesting.
But it's also infused with Buddhist principles. So we're going to be getting this really unique blend of, I guess you could call it Eastern philosophy with like practical communication tips.
Yeah, that's a cool combination for sure.
Yeah. And you know, one of the things that I noticed right away reading NongBee GameBoy's work is that they have a really, really engaging writing style.
Yeah, I noticed that too.
It's almost like having a witty friend kind of like break down these complex concepts. And I think that's one of the things that makes it so approachable. But before we get lost in just like the fun writing style, what would you say is like the mission for this deep dive? What are we hoping to extract from this material?
I think our goal is to give the listeners some good takeaway advice on how to navigate these tough conversations, you know, especially about sensitive topics.
Yeah, and that's something that NongBee GameBoy really emphasizes right from the beginning. It's like this idea of how to have these difficult conversations without necessarily shying away from them or just, you know, resorting to the same old patterns that we all fall into.
Oh, yeah.
So one thing that really struck me in the beginning was this focus on mindset that NongBee GameBoy talks about.
Okay.
And they suggest that instead of going into a conversation with the idea that your opinion is right, you should approach it with the idea that your opinion is just yours. So it's this subtle shift. But what do you think about that? How do you think that can actually help us have more productive conversations?
I think it's actually brilliant because, so much of the reason we struggle to really communicate in those kind of situations is that everyone's coming from this place of thinking, I'm right.
Right.
And so when you change your mindset to thinking, okay, this is just my opinion, my perspective, it takes a little bit of the pressure off of both sides.
Yeah, you're not as attached to being right.
Yeah, exactly. So you're more open to hearing the other side and actually like trying to understand where they're coming from instead of just trying to convince them that you're right.
Yeah, it takes the sting out of disagreeing.
Right, exactly. And it kind of creates this dynamic where you're working together to understand the issue rather than working against each other to prove each other wrong.
Yeah, and I love how NongBee GameBoy puts it in the blog post. They say, since you still cling on to the self, might as well use it in a positive light for change. Haha.
Yeah, they do have a really funny way of putting things.
Yeah, and I think that humor is important, right? Because it keeps it light, but I don't think it takes away from how profound the point actually is.
Yeah, I agree. I think it actually helps to make the point more memorable.
Yeah, totally. So let's say we've adjusted our mindset, right? We're going in with the attitude of, okay, this is just my perspective, my opinion. What would you say is like the next step in NongBee GameBoy's kind of communication toolkit?
Well, I think the next thing they really focus on is active listening.
Okay.
Which they actually call a superpower.
Okay, so active listening, I mean, we hear that a lot, right? Like it's kind of a buzzword in the communication world. But what do you think NongBee GameBoy means when they call it a superpower? Is it more than just, paying attention or nodding your head while the other person's talking?
I think it definitely goes deeper than that. I think for them, it really involves being present in the conversation. Like fully present.
Okay.
Absorbing not just the words, but the emotions and like the underlying meanings behind what the other person is saying.
So it's not just about hearing the words, it's about trying to understand the other person.
Exactly.
On a deeper level.
Yeah.
Okay, but honestly, that sounds kind of exhausting.
I mean, it can be.
Especially like if you're having, a disagreement with somebody.
Right.
Like your mind is already like going a mile a minute trying to come up with your own arguments and counterpoints, and you know how you're going to respond.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's where this idea of mindfulness comes in that NongBee GameBoy talks about. Yeah. Because it's so easy to get distracted and to let our minds wander, especially when we're in those kind of charged situations.
Right.
And so they actually suggest like a really simple breathing exercise. Just to take a moment to kind of center yourself and bring your attention back to the speaker.
So it's like hitting the reset button on your brain.
Exactly.
Okay. That's a good tip. I like that. But I'm thinking, obviously we have to actually respond in conversations, right? It can't just be all about listening.
Right, of course.
Yeah. So how do we balance that need to listen and absorb with also, sharing our own thoughts and feelings?
Well, I think that's where the real challenge comes in, right? Because so often we're already thinking about what we're going to say while the other person is still talking.
Right.
And so we're not really giving them our full attention.
Yeah.
And so I think active listening really requires us to kind of set aside that internal monologue and to just focus on trying to understand the other person's perspective.
Okay, yeah. It's like resisting that urge to score points in the debate.
Yeah.
And instead just trying to understand the other player's strategy.
Exactly.
I'm starting to see why they call it a superpower. Okay, so we've kind of laid the groundwork, right? We've talked about mindset. We've talked about active listening. What would you say comes next in NongBee GameBoy's kind of communication framework?
Well, this is where they introduce a really cool idea that they call the 3-story model.
Yeah, the 3-story model. This is one of the things that I was most intrigued by when I was reading this chapter.
Yeah, me too.
So can you kind of unpack that for us? What is the 3-story model?
Sure. So imagine a building with 3 floors.
Okay.
The first story is your viewpoint.
Yep.
The second story is the other person's perspective.
Okay.
And the third story is like a neutral observer's perspective.
Okay, so it's like viewing the conversation from different vantage points.
Exactly.
Okay, I get that. But how does that actually help us navigate a disagreement? It seems a little bit abstract to me.
Well, the key is in how you actually use it. So NongBee GameBoy suggests that you start with the third story.
Okay.
So you kind of lay out the facts, the context, without immediately injecting your opinion. And that helps to establish credibility and to set a more collaborative tone.
Okay, so start neutral before you dive into your own perspective.
Exactly.
Okay, I can see how that might be helpful. But wouldn't it feel a little bit impersonal? Like, especially if it's a disagreement with, somebody that you're close to.
Yeah, I think that's a valid point.
Yeah.
And I think NongBee GameBoy would agree that context matters. But I do think in a lot of cases, starting with that neutral overview can help to de-escalate things, especially when you're dealing with something that's really sensitive.
Okay, I see how that could work. So we start neutral, then what, do we just jump into our first story and lay out all our arguments?
Well, not quite. Remember that superpower we talked about?
Active listening.
Yes. Active listening comes back in a big way here.
Okay.
So after you present that neutral overview, then you really focus on engaging with the other person's second story.
Oh.
So you ask clarifying questions.
Okay.
You demonstrate that you're really trying to understand their perspective.
So it's about building a bridge of understanding before you present your own case.
Exactly.
Okay, that makes sense. But I mean, does this strategy actually work? People can be pretty attached to their opinions.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
But I think that's where the real magic happens. Because when someone feels like they've been heard and understood, it kind of shifts the power dynamic. Their defenses lower a little bit, and they're more open to hearing what you have to say, even if it's different from their own viewpoint.
So it's like disarming somebody with empathy before you even entered the debate arena.
Exactly.
Okay, wow, that's a really powerful point, I think. And this is already like blowing my mind, and we're just scratching the surface of NongBee GameBoy's wisdom. But I think we should probably pause here and let our listeners absorb all of this incredible advice.
Sounds good.
We'll be back soon with more from our deep dive into NongBee GameBoy's communication toolkit.
You know what really strikes me about NongBee GameBoy's approach is that they acknowledge that disagreements are just a part of life.
Especially when we're talking about things like politics.
Right, exactly. Like you're not always going to see eye to eye with everyone, and that's okay.
It's okay to disagree.
Yeah, but instead of shying away from those conversations, NongBee GameBoy actually gives us tools to handle them productively.
Yeah, it's not about avoiding conflict altogether. It's about engaging in it in a way that's respectful and hopefully leads to some kind of understanding.
Right? It's like they're saying, okay, disagreements are going to happen. So how can we make sure those disagreements are actually productive instead of just destructive?
Yeah, and I think that's a really valuable perspective to have, especially in today's world where it seems like everything is so polarized.
Totally. So I think going back to what we were talking about earlier about active listening, NongBee GameBoy doesn't just say, hey, you should listen to people.
Right.
They actually offer really specific techniques to make active listening even more effective.
Yeah, those techniques are key. So beyond just paying attention, what are some of the things that NongBee GameBoy suggests?
Well, one that I thought was really interesting was the power of rephrasing.
Okay, rephrasing. So what do they mean by that?
So it's not just repeating back what the other person said word for word.
Right.
It's about showing that you've actually grasped the essence of what they're trying to communicate.
Okay, so instead of saying, yeah, I hear you,
right,
you might say something like, so if I'm understanding you correctly, you're saying, and then summarize their point in your own words.
Exactly. It shows a deeper level of engagement.
Yeah, it shows you're not just passively listening. You're actually trying to process what they're saying.
Yeah, and it gives the other person a chance to clarify if you've misunderstood them.
Oh, that's a good point. Because sometimes we think we understand, and then we realize we've totally missed the mark.
Exactly.
Okay, so rephrasing is one technique. What else?
They also talk a lot about the importance of asking clarifying questions.
Okay, clarifying questions. But I feel like sometimes questions can be used in a way that's not so helpful, like they can be kind of leading or even aggressive.
Right. So NongBee GameBoy stresses that your questions should be open-ended and aimed at genuinely understanding the other person's perspective.
Okay, so instead of saying something like, don't you think that's a bit extreme? You might say, help me understand how you came to that conclusion.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's a subtle shift, but it makes a big difference.
Yeah, because it shows you're not challenging them. You're actually curious about their thought process.
Right. And that can really help to create a more open and trusting environment for dialogue.
Okay, this is really interesting. It seems like all these techniques are about creating that bridge of understanding that we were talking about before.
Yeah, it's like you're weaving together different threads to create a stronger connection with the person you're talking to.
And that connection is so important, especially when you're trying to navigate those tricky disagreements.
Absolutely. And speaking of things that can derail a conversation, NongBee GameBoy also talks about the dangers of making assumptions.
Oh yeah, assumptions. We all do it. It's so easy to fill in the blanks with our own interpretations, especially when we're dealing with a topic that we feel strongly about.
Right. And those assumptions can lead to all sorts of misunderstandings and conflicts.
Yeah, because our interpretations are often based on our own biases and experiences.
Exactly. So NongBee GameBoy encourages us to approach conversations with what they call a beginner's mind.
A beginner's mind. I like that. What does that mean exactly?
It means coming to the conversation with a sense of openness and curiosity. Like you're learning about this topic or this person for the first time.
So it's like hitting the refresh button on our perceptions.
Yeah, exactly. And trying to see things with fresh eyes and ears.
Okay, I can see how that would be helpful. But isn't that hard to do, especially when we're talking about something we already have strong opinions about?
Oh, definitely. It takes practice. And this is where I think NongBee GameBoy's Buddhist background really comes into play.
Okay, how so?
Well, in Buddhism, there's this concept of non-attachment.
Right.
Which is about letting go of our clinging to desires and outcomes. And NongBee GameBoy suggests that we can apply this concept to communication by letting go of our attachment to being right.
So it's not about suppressing our opinions. It's about holding them more lightly.
Exactly. And creating space for other perspectives to exist alongside our own.
That makes a lot of sense. And it ties back to what we were saying earlier about shifting our mindset from I'm right to this is just my perspective.
Right. And I think that shift in perspective is really at the heart of mindfulness, which NongBee GameBoy emphasizes throughout their writing.
Mindfulness. It seems like that's a recurring theme. But I think a lot of people associate mindfulness with things like meditation and yoga.
Yeah. But NongBee GameBoy shows us how we could bring mindfulness into our everyday conversations.
Okay. Like how?
Oh, remember that breathing exercise we talked about earlier?
Yeah, the reset button.
Exactly. That's a perfect example of how we can use mindfulness to pause and become more aware of our thoughts and emotions in the heat of the moment.
So it's not just about calming down. It's about becoming more aware of what's happening inside of us.
Yeah. And that awareness can help us to choose a more skillful response instead of just reacting automatically.
Okay. So mindfulness isn't just about sitting on a cushion and meditating. It's about actively shaping the way we communicate.
Exactly. It's a skill that we can develop through practice, just like any other skill. And it's interesting because NongBee GameBoy actually says B knows it's not that easy, but B thinks it's easier than try to understand what B has to say in this program and use it in real life. Haha.
They always bring the humor. But you're right. It's not easy to stay neutral and objective when you're also passionate about the topic being discussed.
Okay, so picture this. You're on a plane, and the pilot suddenly has a heart attack mid-flight.
Oh, no.
Yeah, it's a scary thought, right? And then to make things even weirder, a bunch of elementary school kids suddenly get to decide who the new pilot's going to be.
Wow. That's,
I know it sounds crazy.
Yeah, that's a pretty wild scenario.
It is, and that's kind of the analogy that NongBee GameBoy uses in their blog to highlight what they see as some issues with democracies.
It's definitely a thought-provoking way to start a discussion.
It is. So we're diving into chapter 5 of their blog. Why shouldn't we talk about politics or religion but what if we wanted to?
Right. This chapter is all about taking those Buddhist principles and psychology ideas and seeing how they could actually play out in politics.
Yeah, so it's getting into the nitty-gritty, the practical applications.
Exactly. It's one thing to talk about these concepts in theory, but NongBee GameBoy is really trying to get us thinking about how they could work in the real world.
But before we get too deep into it, we should probably mention NongBee's disclaimer. Right.
Oh, absolutely. They're very clear that these are just ideas, food for thought.
Right, not like a fully formed political manifesto or anything.
Exactly. More like starting points for conversation.
Okay, so with that in mind, let's jump into the first big idea, poor screening of candidates.
Yeah, NongBee GameBoy really goes after the way we choose our leaders.
So what are they saying exactly?
Well, they argue that we tend to focus way too much on popularity.
You mean like charisma and stuff?
Yeah, basically. It's like we're so caught up in who gives the best speeches or looks good on camera that we forget to ask the important questions.
Like, are they actually qualified to run a country?
Exactly. Do they have the skills, the experience, the ethical compass to actually do the job?
I've never thought about it that way, but it's true.
Yeah.
How often do we see candidates with basically zero relevant experience suddenly running for president?
All the time. And NongBee GameBoy is suggesting that we need to completely rethink how we screen candidates.
Okay, so what would that look like?
Well, they talk about focusing on things like a candidate's actual achievements, their track record of leading organizations, maybe even some kind of assessment of their ethics.
So instead of just listening to their speeches, we should be looking at their resumes.
Precisely. It's like applying for a job, you know? You wouldn't hire someone to be CEO just because they're a smooth talker.
That's a great analogy. So NongBee GameBoy is saying we need to apply that same level of scrutiny to the people who want to lead our countries.
Exactly. We need to look beyond the surface and ask, can this person actually handle the job?
That's a pretty big change from how we do things now.
It is, and it's just the tip of the iceberg. NongBee GameBoy has some even more radical ideas about voting itself.
Oh, yeah. I remember something about a voter score.
Yeah.
What's that all about?
Well, this is where that airplane analogy comes back in.
Okay. Remind me again how that goes.
So you're on a plane, the pilot has a heart attack, and suddenly it's up to the passengers to choose a new one.
Right. And in NongBee's version, it's a bunch of elementary school kids making the decision.
Exactly. And their point is, would you really want someone who's never flown a plane before to have an equal say in who's flying the plane?
Probably not. I'd want someone who at least knows which end is up.
Right. And NongBee GameBoy argues that in some ways our current voting system is kind of like that. We give everyone an equal vote regardless of their knowledge or experience in the areas being voted on.
So someone who's never studied economics could have the same voting power as a Nobel Prize-winning economist when it comes to economic policy.
Yeah, and they're suggesting a system where certain factors like education, professional experience, community engagement all contribute to an individual's voter score.
So someone with a higher score would have their vote count for more.
That's the idea. It's a pretty different way of thinking about voting rights.
Definitely. I can already imagine the debates about elitism and fairness, but it's an interesting thought experiment.
It is. It makes us question what it really means to be an informed voter and how we balance the idea of equal voting rights with the need for informed decision-making.
These are some big questions, and ones we'll definitely need to explore more. But for now, let's move on to another interesting point. NongBee GameBoy also thinks our current government structure might be all wrong.
Yeah, they're not a fan of the traditional two-party system. The whole us versus them thing.
Right. It often feels like it's just designed to create conflict.
Exactly. And NongBee GameBoy argues that this kind of adversarial system leads to gridlock and prevents real progress.
So what's their alternative?
Well, they suggest a three-party system, which might sound counterintuitive at first.
I was just thinking that. How would adding another party help?
Well, instead of having the majority and minority parties constantly at odds, NongBee envisions them actually working together.
So no more political mudslinging and grandstanding.
Ideally not. The focus would shift to finding solutions that work for everyone.
Okay, but if the two main parties have to collaborate, who breaks the tie if they can't agree?
That's where the third party comes in. NongBee GameBoy sees them as a neutral entity.
Kind of like a referee.
Yeah, exactly. They'd be made up of people with proven expertise and integrity, maybe from fields like law, academia, or nonprofits.
So instead of a political battleground, we'd have a system where the two main parties are actually encouraged to work together with a neutral third party acting as a kind of tiebreaker.
Precisely. It's a pretty radical departure from what we're used to.
It is, but I can see how it could potentially lead to more effective and less divisive decision-making.
And that seems to be a key theme for NongBee GameBoy, this idea of collaboration. Instead of just trying to score points off each other, the focus would be on finding solutions that actually work for everyone.
So it's less about fighting and more about actually trying to solve problems.
Yeah, exactly. And NongBee GameBoy even suggests that this kind of system could change how politicians interact with each other.
Oh, really? How so?
Well, instead of just constantly criticizing each other, they might actually start working together, brainstorming solutions.
Yeah, I like the sound of that.
Yeah.
But even if everyone's playing nice, how do we actually make sure this collaboration gets results?
That's the big question, right? How do we hold politicians accountable in a system like this?
Because just having them work together doesn't guarantee they'll actually do anything useful.
Right. And NongBee GameBoy has some pretty interesting ideas about that, too.
Like what?
Well, they propose setting up an independent organization that would be responsible for evaluating the government's performance.
So kind of like a political report card?
Exactly. They'd be tracking the government's progress on all sorts of things, like traffic congestion, pollution levels, education standards, you name it.
And this report card would be public so everyone could see how the government's doing.
Yeah, transparency is key here. It's about holding politicians accountable for their actions or inaction.
So no more empty promises and vague pronouncements.
Right. NongBee GameBoy wants to see concrete results.
And how would they measure those results?
They suggest using a grading system based on actual outcomes.
So if traffic congestion gets worse, the government gets a bad grade on that.
Exactly. It's all about measuring the impact of their policies.
And what happens if they fail?
Well, this is where it gets really interesting. NongBee GameBoy suggests that if the government fails to meet certain benchmarks, they could be replaced immediately.
Wait, what? You mean not just at the next election?
Right. It's about creating a system with real consequences. If you're not doing the job, you're out.
Wow, that's a pretty radical idea.
It is. It would definitely change the game.
So no more waiting 4 years to vote someone out if they're not doing what they promised.
Exactly. It's about holding politicians accountable in real time.
It's almost like NongBee GameBoy is applying business principles to politics. Clear goals, measurable outcomes, and consequences for failure.
Yeah, I think you're onto something there. They're arguing that governing a country should be treated like a serious business.
Not just some political game.
Exactly. It's about focusing on results and serving the people.
Okay, so we've got this radical new system for choosing leaders and holding them accountable. But what about the actual policies?
Yeah.
Does NongBee GameBoy have any specific ideas about the direction we should be heading in?
Well, they don't get into specific policies in this chapter. Okay. But they do talk about the importance of fostering a sense of responsibility and shared purpose among citizens.
That makes sense. If you want collaboration and accountability to work,
right,
you need citizens who are engaged and willing to participate.
Exactly. It's not just about changing the system. It's about changing our mindset as well.
So it's not enough to just have better leaders. We need better citizens, too.
Right. We need to be more informed, more engaged, more willing to work together for the common good.
It's interesting that they bring in these ideas from Buddhism, the interconnectedness of everything and the importance of ethical action.
Yeah, I think that's what makes NongBee GameBoy's approach so unique. They're drawing inspiration from all sorts of unexpected places.
It's like they're saying we need to think outside the box if we want to solve these big problems.
And speaking of thinking outside the box, NongBee GameBoy ends this chapter with a bit of a cliffhanger.
Well, what's that?
They mention a comedian in the U.S. who apparently shares similar ideas about political reform.
A comedian? That's interesting. Could humor be a powerful tool for changing the political landscape?
That's a great question, and one we'll have to explore further in our next deep dive.
Okay, so stay tuned, folks, because this political roller coaster is far from over. So in this chapter, he's focusing on what he calls Chapter 6, Summary.
Summary.
And he outlines this framework for having these difficult conversations in a better way.
Okay.
Using Buddhist principles and psychology.
Cool. What's the gist of it?
Well, he starts with self-awareness.
Self-awareness. Okay.
Yeah, he wants us to go through what he calls the no's.
The no's.
Yeah, and first up is no way.
Oh.
Know what you're getting into.
Makes sense. Got to know the minefield before you step in it.
Right. It's like checking the weather before you go hiking.
Yeah. Don't want to get caught in a storm unprepared.
Exactly. So NongBee GameBoy points out two inherent properties of these controversial topics.
That make them tricky.
Yeah, he calls the first one identity challenge.
Identity challenge.
So it's not just about disagreeing on facts or opinions.
It's something deeper.
It's about our core values and beliefs.
The stuff that makes us who we are.
Exactly. So when someone challenges those beliefs,
feels like a personal attack.
Even if it's not meant that way.
Yeah, I can see that.
It's like telling a Star Wars fan that Star Trek is better.
You're not just critiquing a movie.
You're challenging their whole worldview.
Uh-huh. Good point.
And that makes it tough to have a rational, open-minded conversation.
For sure. So what's the second property?
He calls it gray subject matter.
Gray subject matter.
What's that?
It means there are rarely any simple answers.
Ah, I see.
No clear-cut solutions.
It's all nuanced and complex.
Yeah, and full of ambiguity.
So, like, trying to win an argument is impossible.
Yeah, you're just going to get frustrated.
True.
So NongBee GameBoy says recognizing these two properties is super important.
Identity challenge and gray subject matter.
Yeah, before you even think about engaging in these conversations.
So no way is all about understanding what you're getting into.
Exactly.
Before you jump in.
But it doesn't stop there.
Okay.
Then he takes us to NongBee.
NongBee.
Which is all about knowing yourself.
Knowing yourself.
Understanding how we tend to approach these conversations.
Okay, we all bring our own stuff to the table. Right. And this is where NongBee GameBoy's background in Buddhist teachings comes in.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah, he outlines 6 personality types.
6? Wow, that's a lot.
I know, right?
Do we have to figure out everyone's personality type before we can even talk to them?
Great question.
I'm just curious.
It's not that complicated.
Okay.
It's not like we are only one of these types.
Right.
It's more about understanding the different tendencies we all have.
So like a spectrum.
Yeah. We might lean towards 1 or 2 traits more than others.
And that can affect how we communicate.
Especially in those tough situations.
Makes sense.
Like someone who gets angry easily might need to work on staying calm.
Right.
Or someone with blind faith might struggle to consider other viewpoints.
That's true.
So knowing ourselves can help us approach conversations better.
Yeah, I like how he uses ancient Buddhist ideas and applies them to modern problems.
Me too. It's not just philosophy. It's about practical self-awareness.
So true. It's practical stuff.
And he gets even more practical when he talks about dealing with verbal attacks.
Oh, yeah.
Which I'm sure we've all experienced in these conversations.
Totally. Those little jabs or even the big insults.
Yeah, it's so hard to stay calm when someone's pushing your buttons.
It is.
So NongBee GameBoy gives us some interesting ways to deal with this.
Like what?
One is the barking dog analogy.
Barking dog analogy. Here.
So picture a dog barking behind a fence.
Okay.
It's annoying, but would you get down and bark back at it?
I guess not.
Right. Sometimes it's best to just let those insults roll off you.
Just let it be noise.
Exactly. The other person's anger isn't really about you.
They're just barking.
Exactly. And then he has another analogy, the food offering analogy.
Food offering. Sounds interesting.
This one's straight out of a Buddhist parable.
Okay, tell me.
So it's about the Buddha himself.
Oh, wow.
When a Brahmin came up to insult him,
Okay.
the Buddha just calmly said, "Since I don't accept your offering of insults, they remain with you." So it's like choosing not to take in the negativity.
Not taking it personally.
Yeah, you're not rejecting the person, but you're also not owning their anger.
I love that. You have a choice in how you respond.
You don't have to let those emotions control you.
He blends these practical techniques with a deeper understanding of the mind.
He gives us a toolkit for managing our emotional reactions.
That's so important in these conversations.
It is, but he reminds us it's not just about other people's behavior.
Okay.
It's also about understanding where our own reactivity comes from.
So it goes even deeper.
And this is where he talks about the self.
The self.
Or the delusion of self.
Okay. This is where it gets a little philosophical.
I know, it can be tricky.
What does it actually mean? Like practically?
Basically, he's saying a lot of our reactions,
Our anger, defensiveness, need to be right.
all stems from this idea of a separate self.
We cling to our opinions like they define us.
Exactly. So when they're challenged, it feels like an attack on who we are.
But that sense of self is an illusion.
From a Buddhist perspective, yeah.
We create a story and then suffer because we're so attached to it.
So if we can detach from this self concept
We become less reactive.
and more open to other ideas,
That's a huge shift.
it's not about losing your sense of self entirely.
Okay.
It's about loosening the grip.
Right.
Your opinions are just opinions. They don't define you.
So many arguments could be avoided if we all understood that.
Right. That's what's so cool about his approach.
Yeah.
He makes these ancient traditions relevant to today's problems.
It's not just about philosophy.
It's about communication skills.
Yeah, mastering those skills for genuine dialogue.
Right. Putting these insights into action.
So true. He's all about action.
And that's where he takes us next to the crucial skill of self-control.
Self-control, that's a big one.
It's easier said than done.
It is, especially when talking about these hot-button topics.
You're telling me
It's hard
that's why he spends a good chunk of this chapter on it.
on self-control.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm curious to hear what he says.
Me too. His insights are really interesting.
Okay.
So he says self-control isn't just biting your tongue.
Not just suppressing your emotions.
It's about having a deeper awareness
Have your thoughts and feelings.
and choosing your responses skillfully.
Even when you're triggered.
Yeah, it's about being mindful, even in those intense moments.
Not just during meditation.
Exactly. And this mindfulness lets us break free from those automatic reactions.
Those habits.
Instead of just lashing out or shutting down,
Right.
you can pause, take a breath, and choose a better response.
Yeah, hit the pause button on autopilot.
And then choose how you want to respond.
Not just react.
Exactly. And that's where mastering the art of communication comes in.
Okay, so it's not just talking at each other.
It's about truly listening and understanding,
Engaging in genuine dialogue.
which sounds ideal, but it's tough.
It is.
But he gives us practical tips on how to be better listeners.
Oh, I like tips. Tell me more.
He talks about active listening, really paying attention,
Not just waiting for your turn to speak.
and rephrasing what you hear to make sure you understand,
Yeah, that makes you slow down and process what they're saying.
not just jump in with your own interpretation.
Exactly.
He also says to ask open-ended questions,
Not just yes or no.
to get them to share their perspective more.
He's shifting the focus from winning to understanding.
That's it. And he even gives us a framework for these conversations.
Okay, what is it?
He calls it the 3 stories model.
3 stories model.
Think of each person's perspective as a story.
Okay.
The first story is yours. The second is the other person's.
Okay, I'm following.
And then there's a third story, a neutral referee perspective.
Like a judge.
Right, keeping things fair and balanced.
I like it.
And he talks about being the referee in your own conversations.
So it's active, not just passive listening.
Summarizing key points, helping everyone feel heard.
Guiding the conversation.
And he brings back that idea of detaching from the self.
We talked about before.
Your opinions are just yours, not right.
It's so easy to get caught up in needing to be right.
That we forget to listen.
And learn.
That shift in mindset is so important for good conversations.
It turns a battleground into a learning space.
I love that. But we've covered no A, knowing the terrain.
And no B, knowing yourself.
What about no C?
Yeah, what about it?
No C is about knowing the others.
Our conversation partners.
And a lot of no B applies here too.
So we're using self-awareness to assess their communication style.
Yeah, the personality, maybe even their Buddhist personality type.
Right.
NongBee GameBoy even suggests that sometimes knowing the other person means knowing when to not engage.
Really? There are times to just walk away.
He specifically mentions the blind faith type.
The ones closed off to other ideas.
If someone seems totally closed off, it might not be worth it.
It takes 2 to tango.
Right, and he also has a warning, truly wise partners are rare.
So even when someone seems open to reason,
We still need to be careful.
assess their maturity and communication skills.
Choose our battles wisely.
Right. Sometimes it's better to disengage.
NongBee GameBoy reminds us these conversations aren't about winning.
It's about understanding.
And he goes deeper into that in the last part of his summary.
Okay.
But we'll dive into that later.
Sounds good.
I'm excited to hear more.
Me too.
This is great stuff.
It is. NongBee GameBoy is really insightful.
I agree. This deep dive has been so interesting.
Yeah, I'm learning a lot.
Me too.
So before we were talking about how NongBee GameBoy really pushes this idea of understanding over winning.
Yeah, especially in these tough conversations.
Right. So where does he go with that?
This is where he talks about resetting our mindset.
Okay. Resetting our mindset.
What does that even mean?
Yeah, I'm not sure.
Well, he's saying that we often go into these conversations thinking our opinion is right.
Like we have to convince the other person.
Right. Like we have to win the debate.
Which, as we said, usually ends badly.
Especially with these sensitive topics.
Yeah, everyone's so passionate.
Exactly. So NongBee GameBoy says to let go of that right versus wrong thing. Instead of thinking your opinion is right.
Just recognize that it's yours.
Exactly.
It's like you're taking the judgment out of it.
It's not saying all opinions are equal.
Right.
But just acknowledging that everyone has their own perspective.
Yeah, shaped by their experiences.
And beliefs.
And that creates space for real dialogue.
Instead of going into battle,
we're starting a conversation.
With curiosity.
A willingness to learn.
Hey, this is my view. What's yours?
No need to convince anyone.
It takes the pressure off.
You're not trying to win, just trying to understand.
You might even learn something new.
That's the best part.
And NongBee GameBoy says this is at the heart of mindful communication.
Makes sense.
It lets us listen more deeply.
Respond thoughtfully.
Avoid getting caught in those angry reactions.
He's giving us a whole roadmap for better conversations.
With more skill and compassion.
It all fits together. The self-awareness, the techniques.
The listening skills. And now this mindset reset.
It's pretty powerful.
But he reminds us it's a practice.
Right, we're not going to be perfect overnight.
There will be slip-ups. We'll get triggered.
Fall back into old habits.
It's normal, like learning any new skill.
Takes time and effort.
But those mistakes can teach us something.
Yeah, as long as we keep practicing.
Refining our skills. And keeping that intention to understand.
So it's about progress, not perfection.
Exactly. And I think that's encouraging.
It is.
Even if we've messed up before, we can always do things differently now.
We're not stuck.
We can learn and grow.
Become better communicators.
And these skills aren't just for big controversial topics.
Okay.
They help in all relationships.
Family, friends, colleagues.
Even strangers.
It makes sense.
Being mindful and compassionate just makes those connections stronger.
For sure. So what's NongBee GameBoy's final reflection?
Well, he says even with all these techniques,
yeah,
sometimes the best communication is being clear, calm, and respectful.
Like less is more.
It's not about fancy arguments or trying to sound smart.
Just presenting your ideas in a way that's easy to understand.
And respectful.
Which can be so hard when you're passionate.
Oh, I know.
You want to get your point across.
But NongBee GameBoy says those are the moments when this approach is most important.
Because it's easy to get carried away.
And say things you regret.
Yeah, so taking that pause.
Choosing to be calm and clear.
Prevents things from escalating.
And creates space for understanding.
It all ties back to that mindset reset.
Letting go of the need to be right.
Just focusing on communicating well.
It's not about hiding your passion.
It's finding that balance.
Expressing yourself honestly.
But in a way that connects, not divides.
Walking that tightrope between passion and composure.
Yeah, you don't want to lose your fire, but you also don't want to burn it all down.
I love that. That's the essence of what he's teaching.
Finding that sweet spot.
Engaging in tough conversations.
Without sacrificing integrity or relationships.
It's not easy.
But he gives us a good starting point.
And it all comes back to mindfulness.
That awareness of our thoughts and emotions.
Using that to guide our communication.
Skillfully and compassionately.
This deep dive has really shown me how much our internal state impacts our communication.
It's like he's saying, change yourself before you try to change the world.
Start with your own mind.
And watch how that affects everything else.
I think that's a powerful message.
It is.
We can't control how others respond.
But we can control how we show up.
How we listen.
How we communicate.
And even if we don't win.
Or change anyone's mind.
We can still feel good about how we handled it.
That's what matters.
And maybe, just maybe, by planting those seeds.
And mindfulness and compassion.
We can make the world a little more understanding.
One conversation at a time.
What a great goal.
It is.
So next time you're facing a tough conversation.
Yeah.
Remember NongBee GameBoy.
Know the terrain.
Know yourself.
Know the other person.
Reset your mindset.
Communicate clearly, calmly, respectfully.
It's not about winning or losing.
It's about understanding and connection.
And maybe you'll find that even in disagreement.
There's potential for growth and connection.
That's the power of mindful communication.
That's it, that the whole program. Sorry that it's so brief. NongBee tries very hard to extend to full coverage, but this is the best NongBee can do. Hee hee. Don't think anyone on this planet will sit through this short clip in its entirety. If so, please don't forget to do the self-evaluation at the description below before commenting anything. NongBee GameBoy. December 10th, 2024, 12:13.